Hello, you are listening to Through Time and Clades. My name is Albert,
And I'm Joan.
and we are back. It is the first week of March, and so we are going to round off another episode of basically science news stories, well, primarily focused on natural history because that's what we like. Um, yeah, so, you know, how have things been for you recently?
So far things have been pretty good, pretty busy.
Hmm.
No major updates to report.
Right.
Move-in begins this week on Friday, so by the time y'all will get this episode, I'll begin the process of moving into my new apartment with
Mm.
my folks, so that's going to be really great. Um, I guess the other thing that I was brought to attention because we're currently filming. It's Wednesday, March 3rd,
Hmm.
which is World Wildlife Day.
Oh, wow.
So that timing kind of worked out really well for us, I think.
Wow. Oh, I hadn't heard that yet. Or, probably I'd heard it in previous years, but I always forget these kinds of things. There are so many of these special commemorative days that, it's almost impossible for me to keep track of them. But that's really cool. And we will definitely talk about some very interesting wildlife stories today.
Yeah, absolutely. But Albert, what about you? How's life been for you?
Oh, yeah, also no real major updates from me on my end of things. Definitely keeping busy still with the research projects and all that. But yeah, not much I can share yet. So kind of hang in there. It'll be nice doing the show. I think it'll be a nice break from everything else. Yeah,
Absolutely, I agree too.
cool. So I guess if we don't have any other updates to add, should we get started?
Sure, I think one of my stories is first.
Yeah, let me see. Yes, it is. So take us away.
Alrighty, yeah. So this one is a bit of a follow-up from our news episode back in October
Mm.
during the wacky, crazy year of 2020. Um, in that episode, I had talked about this set of Paleo-Indian trackways from the White Sands National Park in New Mexico. That was the one with the individual that was carrying an infant through this muddy field, and it was just a super long trackway.
Being
Well,
followed by
that
Sid.
find right, right, which everybody really appreciated. Um, but yeah, like that find is associated within a larger area that's known as the Tularosa Basin, and many other trackways have been found in this part of the world, particularly of megafauna from the last ice age. Yeah, like ground sloths, but also mammoths and camels and dire wolves, I believe. In fact, one of the most famous trackways from this area was from a recent discovery that we had also kind of discussed a little bit
Hmm.
during the October episode. There was a particular series of footprints that seemed to show a group of human hunters stalking a giant ground sloth. And this story had gained a lot of press. And as you all know, I had made a hilarious artwork commemorating paleo art that went with the that went with the study, that's showing that everybody having a party, a surprise party for the sloth, and that was another one that was they got a big kick out of everybody.
Right.
Um, but yeah, like this particular discovery provided some really good evidence for the sort of human megafaunal interactions that we would expect to find of Paleolithic peoples during the last ice age. Like that's an area of research that doesn't usually have an abundance of evidence like that. If you're lucky, you'll find some like dead animals with like spear points in their bodies or maybe a kill site, but those are so few and far between. And of
Hmm.
course, that goes into the larger discourse about the megafaunal extinctions, but we don't have time to jump into that right now. Um, so it seems that if this particular 2021 study by David Rochelle and colleagues turns out to be true, well, we might have to kind of sadly put away the party hats and confetti cannons because it's possible that a hunting party of humans never did catch a sloth that particular day.
Hmm.
This might actually be an illusion created by stratigraphy. So, what's up here? Well, it all has to do with Paleo Lake Otoro. And for those of you who don't know what that means, it's basically a lake that's now extinct or has been replaced by a different sort of lake in the present day. So I can think about like Lake Megachad in the Sahara.
Hmm.
That was this great lake during the period when the Sahara region was a lot wetter and warmer than it is today, more lush with tropical plants and animals. But has since desiccated, and now all that's left is just regular Lake Chad, which also the name means lake. So lake, if you like. Um, a little bit confusing. But yeah, so previous field studies in the Tularosa Basin have unearthed evidence about this inland saltwater lake, as it is known, or saline. And there was always uncertainty about the overall history. Geologists had managed to kind of map out a rough history of the lake, suggesting that around 35 to 25,000 years ago, the water levels at Otoro were fairly low until the last glacial maximum hit, in which the water levels just spiked and rose. But eventually, by 15,660 years ago, Otoro had desiccated or dried up. And during a period between 15,000 and 10,000 years ago, so now we're kind of entering the Holocene epoch, there was a lot of wind erosion that would kind of hit the dry shoreline and then just kind of lower that ever so slightly. And the key here was that it was during this window of time when all of these megafaunal and human trackways were created, when the supposed hunt was supposed to have taken place. Only for all those footprints and trackways to be solidified and remain exposed for thousands of years until a couple of lucky geologists and archaeologists stumbled across them. So yeah, like this was the overall assumption about this part of the world. A fascinating collection of trackways that just so happened to remain unaltered within 10,000 years after their creation by a collection of lost species and cultures. So the authors of this particular study here were skeptical about this
Hmm.
because when they looked into the literature discussing the overall landscape of the Tularosa Basin, not just this particular area full of trackways, they had found that many of the other lakes in the region actually managed to hang on as bodies of water well into the Holocene
Hmm.
epoch, waxing and waning in water level. So there was a discrepancy here. Why did Paleo Lake Otoro dry up while all these other lakes remained for thousands of years? Was there something missing? Well, to get to the bottom of things, the authors went back and performed a series of analyses on the water levels of Paleo Lake Otoro. They examined the overall stratigraphy, and they even investigated the fossils of microfauna, so things like plankton, and those can provide a boatload of information. You can get climatic conditions, water quality, as well as the general aspects of ecology in the region. And in their study, the authors managed to provide a much more complete history of the extinct lake. And their results suggested something that was more in line with the evidence across the Tularosa Basin.
Hmm.
So, as you can see on the figure here on the right from the paper, you have on the left the traditional model for Paleo Lake Otoro, showing these sort of slow, gradual changes in the water levels, including that prolonged period following desiccation when all those footprints were being made. Well, the new evidence gained has allowed the authors to propose the dynamic shoreline hypothesis, shown on the right here, in which the lake's composition and size changed about different times.
Hmm.
And so here's our new summary of the history of Paleo Lake Otoro. So before 35,000 years ago, it didn't even exist yet. The water levels in the area were actually fairly low, given the impression that the region might have actually been a sort of saltwater marshland of a sort, with all kinds of water plants, and no doubt supporting all kinds of animals that would have feasted on those same plants. There is evidence in this bottommost layer of a different type of water from the overall salty environment. So,
Hmm.
like, there were a couple like odd areas out, which has kind of suggested the possibility that either A, groundwater was leaking into the lake, or B, there were neighboring springs that were feeding into the marshland. So then on phase two, this is now between 35,000 and 25,700 years ago, the water levels in the marshland lowered some more. It was known as a low stand period. And by now, alluvial plains were forming, so sort of a soft sloping sediment that bordered the shoreline and provided the perfect conditions for preserving footprints. So it's during that time that the authors suspect that the various mammoths and sloths and camels were providing trackways. And there does not seem to be any sign of human activity in the area. Now, in time, sediments would bury the tracks and hide them in the earth for the time being. So here on the phase 3, afterwards, the water levels underwent such a great expansion that it was now appropriate to think of the area as a proto-lake.
Hmm.
So the ancestor of Paleo Lake Odoro, if you like. The area was still fairly marshy, as evidenced by the microfossils, but there seemed to have been periods of desiccation that affected the environment on occasion. So again, kind of showing this dynamic nature of this part of the world versus the previously understood static shoreline. So now we've reached the fourth stage. It's after 25,700 years ago, but before 21,000 years ago. And the lake just expanded yet again, and now we can actually call it a proper paleo lake. It's during this high stand period that Odoro's water levels stayed static, and many of the previous plankton that lived in the lake had actually disappeared from the sediment records. So, since we're now in the last glacial maximum, the authors argue that a really great change must have occurred to kind of shift the microfaunal composition like this. And they speculate that the lake actually might have undergone a freshening event through the flooding of water from another source, maybe another lake in the area. And so by now we're at the second to last stage. Paleo Lake Odoro begins to shrink and dry up, again, likely due to the end of the last glacial maximum, which brought about a period of intensely dry conditions to the Tularosa Basin. By 13,600 years ago, this is the final stage, Paleo Lake Odoro actually recovered its water levels by a period of intense rain and moist conditions. The lake wasn't anything like its earlier stage during the last glacial maximum, but it could still support animal and plant life of a sort that has been seen previously.
Hmm.
But then the record ends. There's a period of erosion during the early Holocene epoch that seems to have worn away any successive lake layers, excuse me. But thankfully, there's been a lot of previous research in the area, as we've discussed, that helped the author kind of fill in the gaps. And in general, it seems that Paleo Lake Odoro actually managed to hold on until around 7,300 years ago. So now we're like very deep into the Holocene epoch, much more recent than the previous shoreline hypothesis suspected. But it was living on borrowed time. 200 years prior would have begun the great change in climate and environment in the southwestern US that kind of brought the region closer to its now arid state that everybody knows it by. So you got desiccation and wind erosion and other factors that contributed to the demise of Paleo Lake Odoro and the eventual creation of the present-day Lake Lucero Basin, which is studied today by freshwater researchers, as well as the formation of the White Sands National Park that we've discussed about. And of course, in the end, all those megafaunal trackways would become exposed due to all this erosion and wind. Okay, so now that I've said all of this, well then what about those human trackways? If there wasn't a band of hunters going after a ground sloth, well, whose feet are those? And when did they step there? It's here where the authors lay out their uncertainties. And I thought this was probably the most interesting finding out of all of this. The most important info to this entire study is that the stratigraphic evidence suggests that the sloth trackway, along with those of the other megafauna, was buried before 25,700 years ago, and then exhumed by wind erosion and geologic forces before 7,000 years ago, which is when evidence of Paleo-Indian activity becomes prominent in the region. So in that original paper on these sloth human trackways, those authors suggested that the footprints were formed between 15,000 and 10,000 years ago. But as I just discussed, that doesn't fit with the new stratigraphic evidence from the study. So in order to explain this otherwise unique set of footprints, the authors kind of throw out a bunch of different hypotheses that could be tested with further research. On the positive side of things, the authors do give the possibility that maybe there was a hunt that occurred here, which would mean that this would be evidence of human activity in North America between 35,000 and 25,700 years ago, which, if you kind of consider the growing evidence and subsequent discourse about early human settlements in the Americas, it's not a completely ridiculous idea. It would certainly be like an amazing discovery if that was the case. Um, but the authors do remain a bit skeptical about
Mm.
that. So, moving away from that interpretation, the authors also give the possibility that the human trackways may not even be human at all,
Huh.
but rather that they're tracks from another sloth that has since been warped by time to look like human feet.
Hmm.
And so I've singled out this quote from the paper, which I thought was very enlightening. And I quote: Sloths have oddly shaped ankles, as well as well developed claws, which cause them to put more weight on the outer edges of their hind feet, thus creating a kidney bean shaped track that is slightly larger at the front and narrows towards the back of the print. Historically, this shape has been notoriously misinterpreted as having been giant human footprints. Now, it should be pointed out as well that the spacing between the supposed human tracks in the Tularosa Basin is the same spacing, and thus translates to the same walking gait, as is found between the giant sloth tracks in the basin. Many of the human tracks have been recrystallized in highly ductile gypsum sediment and lack digit morphology that would allow for a more definitive identification of the tracks as sloth or human.
Hmm.
Also, these tracks are poorly preserved and have been marred by taphonomic processes. End quote. So, yeah, there might be a case there as well. Just a couple of sloths having a stroll, really. But then there's the matter of the other trackways associated with human beings alongside Paleo Lake Otoro. They would need to be examined as well to test their validity, and the authors do recognize this. But they also warn that this is a lot easier said than done,
Mm.
given the sporadic nature of the lake's water levels. There's really no telling how much time would have passed during intervals where sediments were exposed for footprints. The time between two individual trackways may be a matter of a few days or a few hundreds of years.
Mm.
So it would be a mammoth task to try to figure out a chronology for all that. And that pun was not intended, by the way. So yeah, in the end, the authors state the skepticism, and they offer their own suggestion that the human trackways were simply made thousands of years after the sloth trackways. Groups of indigenous peoples simply came across these re-exposed megafaunal footprints and just kind of walked alongside them,
Mm.
maybe checking them out here or there. Which would mean, if proven correct, we would lose a really cool discovery.
Right.
But if I can at least put a bit of a positive spin on this,
Mm.
at least now with this study, well, we've gained a whole deeper understanding of this previously mysterious paleo lake,
Right.
and I think that's pretty cool in my book.
Mm-hmm.
What about you, Albert?
Yeah, definitely. I would agree with that. So, I'm not an expert at all in the geology of this region or with trace fossils, but so I think I'm gonna let the people who are experts in those areas figure this out. But yeah, I think if this interpretation is true, we're definitely losing some really cool discoveries as we discussed in the past. However, uh, in the end, we're still learning something new about what was going on at this site, and that's definitely something pretty cool. Um, and I guess because probably someone has to make this joke. What if the tracks were Sasquatch footprints?
Oh, right, a mysterious hominin.
Right.
Oh my gosh, yeah. I mean, who knows? Maybe in the past, Sasquatches love to go after sloths.
Right.
I
Right.
mean, I'm sure they were both hairy folks, so they'd hang out a bunch.
Right. Right.
Maybe
Makes
keep
sense
his
to me.
hair or something. Oh, that's too funny. Yeah, I guess it remains to be seen. I was kind of surprised to learn that, I went back to all the people I followed on Twitter
Mm,
who like study the trackways in this region or who followed these studies, and yeah, there have been no comments on this paper
that's
yet.
that's interesting, huh? Hmm.
So I'm wondering if it's just like they don't know that the study came out, or maybe it's just one of those things where like they kind of see this and they're like, well, maybe not, and
Right.
they're reserving judgment until more studies come out.
Right, right. Yeah, that's curious indeed, because a lot of the time you would definitely see, well, or at least certain people I know when a study comes out questioning their studies are very quick to take to social media and offer their own commentary in response. But of course, not everybody is like that. I definitely would be curious to see what actual responses there come out to this study in the future.
Yeah, same here. Um, but yeah, other than that, that's all I have to say.
Cool.
If you don't have anything else to add, I guess we can jump into your first story.
Okay, we can do that. So let's go to the next slide then. So we're going to go much further back in time with this study, all the way back to the Devonian period in the Paleozoic. Um, and this study talks about a particular species of uh, vertebrate that lived in the Devonian, but also about the overall transition from water to land in vertebrate evolution, which of course is a very well studied and highly studied subject, which is of great interest. So, one particular aspect of the transition from an aquatic environment to a terrestrial environment is that it can often be quite different feeding in the water versus on land. And so we can infer from what we can observe both in the fossil record and in the species of present day that during the vertebrate colonization of land, there was a pretty big change in the method of feeding that was used, or the primary method of feeding. So a lot of fish, so of course the ancestrally aquatic vertebrates are today represented by the several groups of fishes. Um, in fish, feeding underwater often involves a type of feeding mechanism called suction feeding. So when they will come up close to their intended food item and then suddenly open their mouth and water rushes in, hopefully bringing the food item with it, and just swallow the whole thing in one gulp. Usually they'll expel the excess water from their gills as well in the process. But yeah, hopefully the food item gets ingested that way, and it's a pretty effective method of feeding underwater. All kinds of fish do it, and even some of the land vertebrates that have returned to water and now use this feeding method. Um, and in a fish's skull, there are all kinds of adaptations to facilitate suction feeding. So it's very unlike the way it is in a land vertebrate. So in a typical land vertebrate like us, there is pretty much only one joint in the skull that can move, and that is the jaw joint. Um, and so basically, we feed in a very different manner, which is by biting. Uh, so you can imagine why this transition happened, because if you're on land and you come up near a food item, you can't just suddenly open your mouth and inhale, I don't know, like a hamburger or whatever you want to eat. Um, it doesn't work. So instead, land vertebrates typically feed by directly biting their food items, which seems obvious to us, but is a pretty big change from the suction feeding that a lot of fishes use. Now, uh, I mentioned that fishes often have adaptations for suction feeding, and that involves having more joints that are mobile in the skull, besides just the main jaw joint that opens and closes the mouth. They often have, for example, a lot of flexible regions around the gills that allow the gill region to expand outwards and help them inhale more water. In a lot of the ray fin fishes, and specifically the teleost fishes. So those are most of the fishes you can think of, like goldfishes and seahorses and pufferfish and groupers and whatnot. Um, they have additional mobile joints in the front part of their snout, basically. So when they open their mouths, they the bones in the mouth actually also kind of extend forward as well. Like if, next time, if you ever have a chance to watch your typical goldfish feed, or koi or any other kind of common fish that is kept in captivity, uh, you can try to observe this. When they open their mouths, the entire front part of their mouth just kind of sticks out forward and forming a tube, and that's a very effective mechanism for suction feeding. Um, so they have all these different joints in the skull, besides just the basic opening and closing one that is used during feeding. So the question then is, when did this transition take place and how? Uh, when did the ancestors of land vertebrates become more adapted to biting than for suction feeding? And a key taxon in investigating this question is, of course, Tiktaalik, which is a very well known stem tetrapod from the Devonian. Definitely made a huge splash when it was first discovered, to say the least. Yeah, this is an incredible find. If you didn't know, Tiktaalik, it is known from a very complete skeleton, as well as some other materials at this point. Um, and it shows kind of the transition between water to land very well in the vertebrate lineage. Um, so it's got this very broad, flat skull, which is pictured on the slide here. You can see how broad and flat it is, with the eyes on the top of its skull. So quite likely what it was doing was it was probably kind of swimming just underneath the surface of the water with its eyes kind of sticking upward, and possibly it was searching for prey that was hanging out on land, because vertebrates were not the first animals to venture onto land. By this point, there would have been plenty of arthropod groups and other invertebrates that were hanging out there, which could well have been very good food for Tiktaalik and other early stem tetrapods. And so they might have been, peeking out over the surface of the water, looking out for these tasty, buggy meals. Um, Now, in terms of its limbs, it had fins. However, it also had kind of wrist and elbow joints in its pectoral fins. So it might have been able to potentially support its weight a little bit using those limbs. Maybe people have suggested that maybe it could do push-ups, for example, with, since it's got those mobile joints. Um, Now that doesn't mean it necessarily ventured onto land very often. It's possible it didn't do much of that at all, and it was primarily using those limbs to crawl around in shallow water or at the bottom of the bodies of water. Um, we are we are fairly confident at this point, based on studies of locomotion in these stem tetrapods, that these are probably still animals that spent at least most of their time in the water. So uh, they probably weren't like crawling around on land all that often, if at all. But even so, those limbs clearly allow it to probably move around in a very different way from typical swimming motion um, that a lot of other fishes were using. Um, yeah, so it is certainly very informative in terms of kind of the origins of these tetrapod features. And so this new study decided to investigate the question of how it fed. So, did it feed more like a land tetrapod? Did it bite things? Or did it suction feed like a typical fish? Well, as it turns out, it probably did both. So, previously it had already been observed that basically this kind of very wide, flat skull with a lot of sharp teeth kind of lining the edges of its jaws. This would have been a very useful kind of you skull structure for biting things. You can probably find similarities with things like alligators, for example, things that kind of snap at their prey when in underwater in a sort of sideways motion. That could well have been something that Tiktaalik did. But when the authors of the study, basically what they did was they basically scanned the skull, and so they were able to identify all the individual bones in the skull. And the skull is very well preserved, but they did have to do a little bit of what we call retro deformation. So, of course, the bones become distorted a little bit during preservation. So, they tried to use their knowledge of anatomy to give it to restore it back to their probable original shape. And then they looked at the joints between all the different bones in the skull, and to see whether or not these joints were mobile based on comparisons with living animals. Because, of course, there are suction feeding fishes alive today that are useful comparisons, and there are tetrapods today with immobile skulls that could be used for comparison. So they looked at all those things and compared them to Tiktaalik. And what they found was that Tiktaalik, even though it had a skull that was useful for biting, probably did still have some mobility within the different bones in its skull that would have allowed it to use suction feeding as well. And so, for example, the cheek region of the skull, if you will, the big green bones that are colored in on this diagram here, could spread apart slightly. And on the bottom left, if you can make out the regions where they have black circles, so in this particular figure, you're viewing the skull from the bottom. And so what it's showing, those black circles are the places where the joints could rotate within the skull. And so at the front of the skull, close to the front of the skull, towards the bottom, where those purple bones are, the green kind of cheek region of the skull would be able to spread outward slightly. And additionally, the kind of red bones in the back of the skull could also rotate a bit to facilitate this kind of widening of the skull, this motion. And of course, the gills. So Tiktaalik had gills, even though it was a close relative of tetrapods. It still had gills, like pretty much most, if not all, of the stem tetrapods did. The gills, of course, would be behind the skull, and when the skull kind of widened in this motion, it would be able to engulf water into its mouth and expel it out from the gills, while hopefully retaining whatever thing it wanted to eat when it did this. In addition to the gills, they found that this motion would also spread what are called the spiracle cavities. Now, the spiracle is a structure that we technically still have, but we use it in a very different manner, or it doesn't have the same function as it used to in our aquatic ancestors. So the spiracle is actually the equivalent of our eustachian tube. So it's a little channel that connects the inside of the mouth to, well, in our case, to the ear cavity. And there's a little membrane that separates it, cuts it off from the outside in us land vertebrates. But for fishes, the spiracle is actually an open structure, so it connects the inside of the mouth to the outside, basically. And a lot of fishes use the spiracle as a way to help them breathe. So how does this work? Some fish can intake water through the spiracle and pump it over their gills, and that helps them breathe. But it also helps them, in some cases, to breathe air. And probably this was what Tiktaalik was doing with its spiracles as well. So, in case you didn't know, and it really grinds my gears when resources that's supposed to be educational get this wrong. Air breathing is ancestral to all bony fish, not just to land vertebrates, but to all bony fish. Like long before bony fish even considered coming onto the land, they were capable of breathing air. And in fact, we can observe this in living species of bony fish. The default state for bony fish is air breathing. Now they do retain gills from their other fishy ancestors. They can breathe water as well, but they are also capable of breathing air, and they have lungs to do this with. The reason that a lot of living ray-fin fish cannot breathe air is not because they didn't have air-breathing ancestors, which they did, but because they have cut off the connection between the lungs and the kind of rest of the respiratory system to form a different kind of organ called the swim bladder, which helps them maintain buoyancy, but means that they can't really breathe air anymore because there's no connection there. However, if you look at things like outside of Telios, like bikers and gar, they still have functional lungs. They can come up to the surface of the water to breathe air with their lungs if the oxygen in the water is not sufficient. And in fact, some of these fishes have to breathe air to survive. Like they cannot survive solely using their gills because they can't gain enough oxygen that way. So these are fishes that can actually drown if you don't let them breathe air, which is pretty
Wow.
wild. But yeah, it is a bony fish thing to do. Um, so now you might assume that when they're breathing air, they would come out and take a big gulp using their mouth. But they actually have a sneakier way of breathing air in many cases, and that is by using the spiracles. So the spiracles are, in the back of the skull on the top and kind of behind the eyes. So people have observed bikers, for example. Okay, and I guess if you didn't know, bikers are a kind of a ray fin fish. They are found mostly in Africa today, I believe, and they are very, very cool looking. Definitely check them out if you are not familiar with them. But in any case, they are one of these types of bony fishes that can still breathe air. And what they'll do is they'll actually come up to the surface and just poke the top of their head out, letting their spiracles show. And in doing so, they are able to breathe air from their spiracles. So that's a very sneaky way of breathing air and helps them hide when they don't want to be seen. And so something like Tiktaalik, it was probably able to breathe air with its spiracles as well. And since it had these mobile joints in its skull that would be able to help it expand kind of its spiracle opening, this might have helped it breathe air, this kind of skull mobility. So Tiktaalik, they concluded, was probably able to both suction feed and bite its food, depending on its, what happened to be more useful at the time. And they do suggest some living analogs for this kind of behavior, namely gar. So gar are these ray fin fish with very long and toothy snouts, and they are able to catch prey by biting. They can sweep their long snouts to the water to quickly catch their prey, but they are also capable of suction feeding as well, which they do in a very similar way, kind of opening their mouth and expelling water through their gills. So basically, Tiktaalik, a stem tetrapod, may well have fed like a gar, and so possibly in the evolution of land vertebrates, we went through this phase where both suction feeding and biting were means of feeding. And gradually we ditched the suction feeding part as we spent more and more time on land. So this was a pretty cool study. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense, especially for an animal like Tiktaalik, which it's interesting you bring up like gar. Well, I know like well, first off, I know like the name Tiktaalik is like an Inuit word that means like large freshwater fish,
Right, yeah.
which is basically what a gar is.
You're
Uh,
right.
and I'm reminded of like the alligator gar, for example,
Ooh,
which I've seen
yes.
at many aquariums, and it's maybe this is not the right word to use. It's a very primeval looking fish. Like
Yeah,
it
right, right.
reminds me of Tiktaalik whenever I see it.
Right, yeah, yeah.
So I think it's apt comparison.
Indeed, yeah, yeah. They definitely like they're not especially close relatives, but you definitely do get sort of that vibe when you see Gar for sure. Um, I guess something else that's worth mentioning is that, of course, land vertebrates are not members of the ray fin fishes like the bikers and gars are. They are members of the lobe fin fishes. And even though we do still have some living members of lobe fin fishes alive today that are, not land dwelling, that are still fishy, these representatives, the authors point out, might not be particularly good analogs for the feeding method of Tiktaalik. So the fishy lobe-fin fishes that are still with us today are the coelacanths and the lungfish. Um, and in the case of coelacanths, it's mostly because people haven't studied their feeding mechanism that much. They're very difficult to study. They're mostly found in rather deep waters, and so actually observing how they function in life is very difficult. And yeah, so mostly anything that's been written about kind of the actual mechanics of their feeding has been done based on looking at dead preserved specimens and not observing living animals. So it's difficult to say much, or to make much comparison with coelacanths. And in the case of lungfish have very, very weird skulls. So instead of this very mobile skull that a typical fish has, lungfish have highly fused skulls with many of the bones all fused together. Certainly, at least in the living ones. So they don't really make good analogs for suction feeding either because they don't do that much suction feeding. Um, what they're well adapted for is crushing things. So they like to eat things with hard shells, like snails, for example. And they have these very impressive tooth plates for doing this with. But yeah, not a very good analog for Tiktaalik in this case.
Yeah, they're very like derived anatomy compared
Right,
to these sorts of animals.
definitely. Yeah. Do you have anything else to add about this story?
No, not particularly.
Okay, so I think I'm done too. So let's go on to your next story then.
Yeah, sure. And we're gonna shift back to the living world now with this one, and I guess yeah, technically the last two stories too. Before we get ahead of ourselves,
All right.
um, I thought that this study was pretty fun,
Mm-hmm.
and as always, like I'm particularly attracted to research that reveals new information about living animals.
Mm-hmm.
Even our most popular and familiar species have secrets.
Right.
And this experimental study by Samuel T. Fabian and colleagues unravels an aerial quirk of the dragonfly, which I'm sure we've all seen. Um, what the researchers found was that dragonflies undergo a process called flight stabilization whenever they find themselves upside down or out of balance while flying. Dragonflies, after all, are speedy predators that inhabit freshwater environments, so it pays to be a good flyer. During the stabilization process, a dragonfly will actually do a sort of backflip in order to readjust themselves and stay right side up.
Hmm.
Now, I went ahead and revealed the big finding because I thought it would be a good segue into the question of just how the researchers did this
Mm-hmm.
and found it out. And depending on who you are, like I think it's kind of hilarious and ingenious too, for that matter. So, inside a wind tunnel, the researchers took 20 dragonflies, and those are the common darters of Europe, to be precise, and they decorated each of them with 6 custom mocap markers. So that, yeah, that's sort of the same technology that you see in like big budget Hollywood films like Avatar, motion capture technology. And then they took magnets and placed them on the dragonflies as well. And this was to help stabilize their subjects, as the insects needed to be held either right side up or upside down. So you have like two different modes of orientation. And then, after placing them at different altitudes, they would lift the magnets and then just let the dragonflies fall into the wind tunnel. Now, of course, given the mocap markers, everything was filmed on HD mocap cameras so that like subtle movements can be tracked and then translated into 3D computer models that can be further studied. So, within about 48 milliseconds of being dropped, the right side up dragonflies would begin to flap their wings and undergo this stabilization. The researchers stated that on average it took about 400 milliseconds for a dragonfly to reorient themselves. For those that were put upside down and then dropped in the wind tunnel, this process took a teeny bit longer
Mm-hmm.
at 506 milliseconds. But nonetheless, they managed to stabilize themselves through their backwards flipping most of the time.
Wow.
Now, here's where things get interesting. The researchers then chilled their dragonfly subjects. So they put them on ice for about 20 minutes. Now, as any bug collector knows, cooling an insect at certain temperatures causes them to go dormant or anesthetized.
Mm-hmm.
These dragonflies were fine, of course, but their neural functions were severely inhibited. But experiment-wise, it was same strategy. They dropped the dragonflies in the wind tunnel, right side or upside down, and in the former state, the dragonflies were able to slow their free fall with the stabilization. But what about the latter state? What is a basically unconscious, upside down, frozen dragonfly gonna do when it's in free fall? Well, it turns out that even an unconscious dragonfly can still stabilize itself by backflipping.
Wow.
Taking on average 178 milliseconds to reach the so-called maneuver midpoint. And so, thus, the authors found out dragonflies could undergo a passive flight stabilization even when they're inhibited. But there was still just one question left. Did the wings have anything to do with this process, or was there something else involved? And this is when a final test was needed. And so the authors waited until their captive dragonflies died natural deaths. And I mean, they only live on average for about 1 to 2 weeks anyway. I think it was like 6 weeks at most, but that's very rare instances.
Hmm.
Then, before their limbs and wings could stiffen, as dead insects will do, the researchers performed the same experiment. Only this time, the dragonfly's wings were either folded upwards or they were kept splayed out, like you might see on the image here. Now, during free fall, the wings in both of these states didn't do much. So they tried other poses. And that was where the kicker lied. So when the dragonfly wings were bent at mean angles of 110 degrees for the forewings and 140 degrees for the hind wings, the dead animals, when upside down, still managed to flip their bodies right side up,
Wow.
albeit with a bit of additional spinning.
Right.
Not a foolproof process. It would take about 190 milliseconds to reach the maneuver midpoint. So yeah, in doing this interesting experiment, the researchers discovered this quirk of dragonfly flight abilities, and it seems to come very simply to them. So it's a combination, possibly, of the wing position as well as perhaps general muscle movements.
Hmm.
And the dragonflies can realign themselves right side up. If it's flying through the air and it finds itself in an odd position. As again, it often happens sometimes with
Hmm.
with dragonflies. And on a related, unrelated note, I would like to end with a quote from the final paragraph of the paper. Our biomechanics and modeling work demonstrate that even at the insect scale, morphology and posture can provide passive aerial stability and reduce the necessity of active control. This lesson from biology can inspire design principles for fail-safe attitude recovery in micro-aerial systems.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, basically, opportunities to experiment with aeronautics technology might be gained from chucking dragonflies through a wind
Right.
tunnel.
Right.
Which that's just yet another example of this larger phenomenon where you have human engineering finding potential inspiration from the natural world.
Hmm.
So I think that's pretty cool, I would say.
I would agree. Yep.
Yeah. Was there anything you wanted to add to this?
Oh, not too much. I do think it's an incredible finding. Yeah, and dragonflies are such amazing flyers. I'm sure we can learn a lot from how they do things. Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. um, all right, I guess would we like to move on to the final story?
I suppose we can. All right. So our next story is also on living animals and on living flying animals. Though we've been seeing a lot more of this group of flying animals in our show so far, birds. Um, but this study was not about flight. It's about something a rather different kind of behavior. Um, this study was done on superb lyrebirds. And if you're not familiar with lyrebirds, they are a type of Australian songbird, but they don't look much like songbirds at first glance. First of all, they are much bigger than most other songbirds. They are around the size of a chicken. Um, and they are basically songbirds trying to be pheasants in terms of their appearance and ecology, you could say. Yeah, so the males have these incredible display feathers on their tail, and I pictured a male here. So you can see like it's got these two really long, broad tail feathers with these kind of brown bands running across them, but also a lot of like much thinner, kind of wispy white feathers as well. And this all kind of comes into play when they do their courtship displays. So what male lyrebirds will do is that they will kind of make these mounds of bare soil in their kind of forest habitat, and then they'll stand on top of these mounds and then kind of perform their displays to females. And they'll, for example, spread out these long tail feathers, and they really do look a bit like a lyre when they do this. You should look up some photos if you haven't seen this kind of behavior. But in addition to the visual component, they also have a very complex kind of vocal component to their display as well. So these are songbirds after all, and like other songbirds, they learn a lot of their calls instead of knowing them innately. So in that sense, songbirds are actually quite a bit like us humans, in that we are able to learn specific sounds and then repeat them back and then use them for specific purposes, and like I'm doing now. And well, songbirds do this too, and their songs in particular tend to be learned phrases, which are often used in courtship, but sometimes for other purposes as well. And lyrebirds in particular are basically masters of vocal learning. They are master mimics. And you might have seen footage in wildlife documentaries showing this. They can mimic calls of other kinds of animals. They can mimic various even human-made sounds that they happen to come across, such as camera shutters and chainsaws and things like that. Now, it must be said that the very famous kind of sequence of a lyrebird mimicking all of these different sounds that you might have seen from David Attenborough's Life of Birds series, that's an excellent series, by the way, I highly recommend it. That particular sequence was actually filmed with a captive lyrebird, so that was not actually a wild lyrebird doing all these sounds, but nonetheless, wild lyrebirds are still excellent mimics, and certainly do incorporate the sounds of many other animals and also just natural sounds in general into their courtship display. So possibly, showing off all the different sounds a male lyrebird can make makes him seem like a more desirable mate. But this particular study found that male lyrebirds also use their mimicry for possibly another purpose as well during courtship. And what they found was that under certain circumstances, it seems that male lyrebirds will produce a specific type of vocal display that is specifically mimicking the sound of a mobbing flock of other species of songbirds, which is quite an incredible feat. So what this entails might require some explanation. So mobbing is a kind of behavior that is found in many kinds of animals, not just birds, although birds are pretty well known for it. It basically involves often a large group of these animals, usually smallish animals. When they catch sight of a predator, what they will do is that they will actually kind of gather around the predator and draw attention to it by making vocalizations or whatever. And there are probably several reasons to do this kind of mobbing behavior, but probably a major one is what they're doing is that they are drawing attention to the predator and showing the predator that you've been seen, so don't bother trying to catch us because we know you're right there, and you better try your luck somewhere else. And a lot of birds will do this, and they will even, multiple species will come together when they hear mobbing calls and just surround an unfortunate predator and just draw attention to it by just, calling at it. And they also have specific sounds for this purpose. I've heard it said that the pishing noise that is sometimes recommended as a way to attract birds. So at least in North America, I don't know if it really works anywhere else, but in North America at least, it's often said that you can attract songbirds to you by making this psh, 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 psh noise.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and I've tried it before. It certainly works sometimes. It's been said that it might be a sort of mimicry of mobbing calls given by things like chickadees, for example. Yeah, I actually have a fun story related to this. It's a bit of a tangent, but it's a fun story where I was birding while I was in Maryland. I did my college degree there, and I was just walking along the forest trails nearby, and I saw a stray cat wandering through the forest. And well,
Mm.
I'm gonna get on my soapbox right now and say, please keep your cats indoors, and if you let them outside, please supervise them. Don't let them out of your sight. Please do not let them kill all these native wildlife because that is a big conservation problem. We've documented, feral cats and outdoor cats killing literally billions of wildlife individuals every year in North America and also in Australia, possibly other places too. We just haven't done the surveys for it. Um, but yeah, in any case, cats can live perfectly, healthy, enriching lives indoors, and as well as being given a supervised outdoor time as well. So please, be responsible pet owners. It's much safer for the cats too, because there are of course cars and malicious people and predators a lot of the time outdoors, which can hurt them. So yeah, keeping the cats indoors is better for everybody. Anyways, I'm sure we'll probably get a lot of downvotes for that. But in any case, I saw this stray cat wandering around in the woods. Now, that is, of course, not a native predator. That, frankly, has any big business being there. So I decided to, sort of intervene, I guess. But of course, I didn't want to hurt the cat or anything. So instead of directly scaring it, I decided to make the pishing noise. Just to warn the birds around that there was a cat there, and it actually several chickadees showed up, and they kind of took notice of the cat, and eventually the cat realizing it had been spotted by potential prey, it went away and slinked off. So yeah, that was kind of an interesting story I have.
That's awesome. You
Yeah.
saved those birds.
I guess so. You could put it that way. But yeah, in any case, mobbing calls are often very distinctive. That's when the birds or other animals are kind of rallying the troops, as it were. So they have very recognizable calls when they're mobbing a predator. So it turns out that these researchers recorded these male lyrebirds um, mimicking the mobbing calls of several different kinds of other songbirds, in quick succession. And they mainly mimicked the mobbing calls of I think three specific species, but they will sometimes throw in others as well. And not only that, but also like alarm calls, probably made by opossums. Yeah, these
Oh,
marsupials. Yeah, and I guess just to be clear, we are not talking about the American species that are often called possums, or more properly opossums. So Australian possums are also marsupials, but they're not closely related to the American opossums. Um, yeah, the Australian possums are more closely related to things like kangaroos and koalas. And a lot of the time, people make comments about how the Australian possums are much cuter than the American ones. Um, you know, fair enough if you think that, but American opossums are plenty cool too. They're quite harmless animals. There's no need to be particularly frightened of them. They don't even carry rabies all that often, so you don't even have to worry about that. Um, and in addition, they are also very ecologically helpful to us because they eat a lot of ticks. When ticks cling to them, they end up getting groomed off very regularly and getting eaten by opossums. So they actually help prevent the spread of Lyme disease too. Um, Something else I want to mention is that there are actually many species of opossums in the Americas, but only one gets over the border between the United States and Mexico. Only one gets that far north, and so that's the only one that people tend to be familiar with, and that is the Virginia opossum. But there are actually a lot of other types of opossums, and even other types of non-opossum marsupials down in South America too. So South America is actually really also quite a diversity hotspot for marsupials. Marsupials are not just limited today to Australia, as is sometimes implied. So yeah, anyways, a bit of a kind of mammalogy lesson there. But in any case, these lyrebirds, they will often incorporate not only alarm calls of birds, but also possums into their kind of this this big mimicry display of mobbing flocks of songbirds. And not only that, but they'll even incorporate wing beat noises of these birds. So, all these birds are coming in and rushing towards a predator. They don't attack the predator directly, but they'll kind of rush at it and annoy it a little bit, just to drive the point home. And yeah, the male lyrebirds will include the wing beat noises as part of their display. Um, and so the researchers took recordings of these mimicked sounds, and then analyze them. Looking at the waveform as is pictured here. So on the bottom there, they're showing the waveform of or the frequency, kind of in a visual format of the mimicked sound of a lyrebird on the bottom, and the actual mobbing flock sounds on top. And there are certain similarities there. Um, in fact, the lyrebirds also do a few other tricks to make this even more convincing. For example, they will mimic different individual birds, and overlap those calls on top of each other. So it sounds like they're not just mimicking one bird after another; they're mimicking several at once. They'll do this with the same species of birds, overlapping calls of different individuals, but they'll also do this with different species of birds and overlapping their calls together. And so it really sounds like a very convincing kind of soundscape of a whole flock of birds that has seen a predator and are making a big fuss about it. And so, in addition to kind of visually examining the similarities, the researchers also did analyses, like kind of scoring different traits of the sounds and running them through a computer analysis. And it turns out the computer analysis indeed grouped together the lyrebird mimicking calls with the calls of the species they were mimicking. And not only that, but the researchers also played sounds of lyrebirds mimicking these mobbing calls to these songbirds who were being mimicked. And it turns out that these songbirds would respond to the calls and come in and check out what's going on. Is there a predator here? And they would actually respond to it. So all of these lines of evidence combined really seem to suggest that the male lyrebirds are indeed mimicking the sounds of a mobbing flock of other songbirds. Now, why did they do this? Well, it turns out that they only performed this display under certain circumstances, and that was when the females were exiting their display site. So, when the male lyrebirds are doing their courtship display, the females come and check them out. And it turns out when the females were trying to leave was when the males would start doing this kind of mimicry of mobbing birds. And also in the middle of copulation. So while the males are mating with the females, they would also perform this display. And so the researchers suggest that the function of the display might not necessarily be a direct indicator of male quality so much, but it might actually be a way to try and, convince the females not to leave, basically, during these critical parts of courtship. So it might be a way to tell the females, basically they're trying to trick the females into thinking, look, there's this big mobbing flock of birds around. They probably saw a predator nearby. Are you sure you want to leave so soon? Why not stick around here where it's safer? So yeah, that seems to be a likely function of this mimicry display. They did this while the female is exiting the display site for obvious reasons, and also during copulation, because the male needs time during copulation to make sure that his sperm, actually gets in there. So he doesn't want the female to leave just yet, and he will perform this display while mating. And not only that, but it seems that the male lyrebirds will go to lengths to basically try and make it seem like the mobbing sound is not being made by him. Like during mating, for example, the researchers observed the male lyrebird actually covering the female's eyes with his wings while he was doing this display, so that she could not actually confirm for herself whether or not there really was a mobbing flock of birds around nearby. So yeah, it's a really fascinating bit of behavior that's going on here, and definitely it seems that there might be a little bit of a kind of a sort of conflict between the sexes going on here. Like it probably the male lyrebirds were selected for such a convincing display because females would be able to see through or I guess, hear through the mimicry and decide, okay, maybe this is not a real kind of mobbing flock, and I should leave if I want to leave. Um, and so the males get better and better at doing this mimicry, and female lyrebirds can also mimic. Female lyrebirds also have song as well, and that kind of brings me to a kind of related point, is that something that's really been overlooked historically is that a lot of female songbirds are actually perform singing displays as well. It used to be thought it was primarily just the males, but it turns out that is in many cases not true. um, so female lyrebirds are definitely one of the species that are known to also perform mimicking displays, but they have never been recorded doing this kind of mimicry of a mobbing flock. It's something that seems that only the males do, even though the females should be capable of doing it too. So it really does seem like that it is tailored to this specific function that the males are doing. Um, and I guess the last thing I want to mention is that this bit particularly surprised me, is that this is actually not the first time that this kind of behavior has been recorded in a certain species of animal. So the researchers actually cite a study that says male topee antelope. Now they are antelope are not like vocal mimics that we know of, so they don't do something this elaborate and complex. But apparently, male topee antelope will like give out their own like species specific alarm calls when they sense that females are trying to leave them, basically, and probably for very similar reasons to the lyrebirds. And so this kind of behavior actually does have precedent in kind of recorded observations before. So yeah, that I thought that was really interesting, and that was pretty surprising to me. Yeah, it's definitely I think incredible how complex that this whole thing is. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely fascinating for sure. My mind is racing now with like thoughts about like the evolution of behavior like this.
Right.
Like your discussion of like how like this might have been like fine tuned over the generations as it was successful to make it even more successful. It kind of reminds me of our discussion on cuckoo eggs,
Oh yeah.
and it's like it's sort of the same sort of thing going on. I think that's just incredible.
Right. Right. Definitely.
Also a little bit dirty, not gonna lie. Like lyrebirds, like I see you.
Yeah. Yeah. They really are kind of liars in this instance, aren't they?
Yeah, very appropriate.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, definitely really interesting study. I was the yeah, it took a while for me to decide what studies I should pick for this month's episode, but yeah, when I saw this study, I was like, wow, that is amazing. I definitely have to talk about this. Um, so yeah, here we are.
Yeah, when you even told me about it, like it was definitely new to me. Like I mean, like I knew about like the mimicry of lyrebirds. I
Right,
mean,
right.
I've known that since I was a kid.
Hmm.
My introduction to this bird was wild thornberries.
Oh yeah.
When like one of their episodes, they go to Australia, and Nigel Thornberry. Oh, there's the lyrebird up in the tree. It's a lyrebird, and then the bird is like, it's a lyrebird, and then and then Nigel says, and
Right.
that was like a joke I repeat with my sisters all the time. So, but yeah, like to this like complexity of
Right.
like mixing like same species and different species, and like oh my gosh, like the mental work it must take to
Yeah.
process all of that and put it as a song. It's wow. Yeah.
Right, right. Yeah, truly incredible, definitely. All right then. I guess with that, should we wrap up?
Sure.
Okay. Let's see. So, as always, we'd like to thank our friends for the music and the color scheme of my avatar. And if you enjoyed the show, please follow us on Twitter so you know when a new episode comes out, and subscribe to the channel so you can also know when a new episode comes out. Please send us any questions and comments you might have, either to our email or by leaving YouTube comments. We do enjoy receiving those. And of course, we will link to all the papers we talked about in this episode in the description. Um, and next week, I believe, we are going to go back to our human origins series, and Joan will introduce us finally to our own species, Homo sapiens. Is that right?
Yep, that's about right. And we're gonna take a long look at the middle and late Stone Age of Africa as well.
Wow.
It's a lot of fascinating history there.
Excellent, excellent. Definitely looking forward to that. All right. So, thanks for listening, everybody, and please take care and stay safe, everyone.
Yep. To see you next time.
See ya.